with Professor Kate Sang from the Institute of Gender and Employment Studies of the Heriot-Watt University. We speak about her work in equality and diversity, in particular in disability in highly skilled jobs. How does academia stand in comparison to industry? What challenges do disabled people face, and how they should be addressed? And what changed her mind in following a career in psychology?
You're listening to Inside, the University of St. Andrews Physics Society's podcast. I'm your host, Veronika Sedláková. Join us as we journey through the lives of St. Andrews academics, discovering their passions, inspirations, and motivations. Today's interview is with Professor Kate Sang. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
Before we start, I would like to note that when we are recording this, the circumstances do not allow us to meet in person, so we are conducting the interview online. I would like to apologize to our listeners if the audio quality is lower as a result of this. Thank you for your understanding. Without further ado, Professor Sang, could you please tell us what your positions at Heriot-Watt are, and perhaps elsewhere as well?
Yeah, so I'm based in the Edinburgh Business School at Heriot-Watt. I'm a professor of gender and employment studies, and I'm also the director of the Research Centre into Employment Work and the Professions, which we've called CRUES. So that's what I do within Heriot-Watt. I'm also on my UCU branch committee as the Equality Officer, and as of 1st of June, I'll be the Equality Officer for UCU Scotland nationally. So I'm quite active in our trade union, and I also sit on the REF panel for equality and diversity. And we are, as you can probably imagine, right in the middle of all the really heavy sessions of that now because the REF submissions have all gone in. So our role there is to really monitor the equality and diversity aspect across submissions. I'm also on the Equality and Diversity Advisory Panel for the Law Society of Scotland. That's a new appointment. I've only had one, at the time of this recording, had one meeting, but that's, at the moment, I'm just learning more about the legal profession in Scotland and what my role will be on that. And I also sit on the ED panel of an organisation called ARMA, which is the Association of Research Managers. So within universities, it's the kind of people that run your research and enterprise and development teams that help process grant applications and all of that. And then I also sit on an equality and diversity advisory panel for the Canadian Research Councils, which is similar to UCRI, but particularly on their professorial panel. So that's all the things that I do, lots of panels.
That is a lot of things. That sounds very exciting, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
And what was your path that led you to all these diverse positions?
So I've had quite an unusual academic career. So I did my degree, my master's at Dundee University, so just across the water. And my undergraduate degree was in psychology and history, but I knew that I wasn't comfortable with psychology, and probably we'll talk about that a little bit more as we start talking about disability. And I got a job, and it was a real job, and it didn't pay very much. And an opportunity came along to do a funded master's at Dundee, which actually paid more than my job did. So I did that, and that was in the civil engineering school at Dundee, which is obviously quite different from psychology and history. And it was a master's by research, and my research was looking at women's careers in the construction industry. And I realised that actually I really enjoy research. I've always been a feminist, and I don't think I really appreciated that it was possible to have a career, doing feminist work. So I then moved to Loughborough University, which is in the Midlands, to the civil engineering school, and completed a PhD there looking at gender in the architectural profession. And when I finished that, I then did a postdoc at Loughborough Economics. So that's another discipline change again, but that was using quite similar methods. And what became apparent to me then is I was really interested in employment. And when I looked across all the research I'd done, what was really interesting to me was work, the world of work, how we make that better for people, and also the persistent marginalisation of certain groups of people. So I made a decision to move to a job at the University of East Anglia, which was lower pay, but it got me into a business school. And I was a research fellow there for about 2.5 years, doing research around equality and diversity, lots of different aspects around migration, gender and ethnicity. And that then led me to Heriot-Watt, and I got my lectureship at Heriot-Watt in 2012. I was told quite early on in my career it's not possible to have an academic career looking at equality and diversity research, and I didn't believe that person and decided to focus on that. And I think it's really important, whatever kind of research you're doing, that you have a commitment to it. And if you have that commitment to it, the other aspects of it are going to become a lot easier to do, whether it's like the kind of knowledge exchange, sitting on committees, things like that. And what I've realized is sometimes it's not about the actual things that you know, it's the skills that you've developed, the research skills, and how valuable they are. So one thing I actually forgot to mention is that I was part of the first group of people to sit on the cross-party working group of the Scottish Parliament on women's health. And that was a really interesting experience for me to work with parliamentarians. And I also was an expert advisor to the Scottish Government on disability, which then gives you an insight into how policy is made. So, yeah, so I've had quite an unusual career path. So that way I've skipped disciplines, but the thread through everything I've done has been inclusion at work.
Mm-hmm. That sounds really interesting. I like how it is a very crooked path, but it lets you, like, you followed your passion, and it sounds really, really interesting. That's really great. And can you tell us more about your current research then?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So broadly, my research at the moment falls into health at work. So I'm particularly interested in disability, and I know we'll be talking about that a bit more. Our current project, Inclusion Matters project, funded by EPSRC on disability inclusive science careers. So I'm really interested in that, but I'm also interested in women's health at work, which is an area that there's very little research in. So we're doing work around gynecological health, around menstruation, and that's an area that we're building up at the moment. So what I'm really interested in is how can we help people stay in good jobs? So not just a job. And for a long time, the government's mantra was being at work is good for you. And actually being at work isn't good for you. Being in a good job is good for you. So trying to think, okay, well, how do we do that then for women? How do we do that for disabled people? How do we do that for minority language users like deaf people who use British Sign Language? How do we do that for migrants? So thinking at the moment quite broadly about what is a good job and how do we help marginalised people access and stay in good jobs.
Interesting. Can I just ask what is right now your concept of what is a good job then?
So there's a number of different frameworks. So the UK government has the Taylor Review, which sets out certain criteria, and then the Scottish government has the Fair Work framework. And they're sort of broadly the same. And they generally focus around having a voice at work. So good trade union representation at work, having fulfilling work. So work that is interesting to you, that gives you a sense of purpose, work that is paid properly. So we've done research around in-work poverty. And obviously it's important not just to be paid well, but to actually get paid at all. And things around the opportunity to develop, so whether you want to learn new skills or get promoted. So it's a job that's meaningful for you and enables you to live a good life and is safe and that you have a good voice in.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very important. That is right. And since this is a very different interview to the usual techie, physicsy ones that we do, I was wondering if you could also give us a brief overview of your field, just for context. I know that you mentioned some things, like some things are not too researched, some things there will be. If you could give us some overview, key moments, brief history.
So broadly, my research fits into employment and work and studies of work, the sociology of work. And for me, it's probably comes a lot from women's exclusion from work, or once we were not excluded from work, the fact that we're not paid the same still. So we had the Equality Act in 2010, which isn't that long ago, and that brought together various strands of equality legislation. And it's one of the things I always say to students, the Equal Pay Act came in 1970, and we still don't have equal pay. So that's the kind of background, really, is this idea around equality. What does it mean? What would it look like? But also what we've seen more recently is a move away from what's called the business case. So historically it was, we need to employ more women because women bring all these different skills to the workplace and we need those skills at work, or we need to employ more people of colour because then that better represents our customer base and we'll make more money, towards a kind of more social justice case for equality at work, that it's the right thing to do. And we've seen a lot of these debates. You still had a lot of organisations respond to the Black Lives Matter protests and the murder of George Floyd. but also around sort of broader issues. We're seeing a lot of negative effects for women from the COVID pandemic in terms of employment. So that's sort of where things are moving to now in many ways, is towards that it becomes almost part of corporate social responsibility or an employer brand to be a good employer. And I think through the pandemic, we've seen examples of companies that were clearly not good employers that we as customers have moved away from, and people being more interested in supporting small businesses, local businesses, for example, but also noting where staff were treated well. So that's kind of where my particular field is. A lot of focus has been on gender, and I imagine that the people listening to this will be familiar with Athena Swan, but there isn't really any comparable kite marks, if you like, for race and disability. Or you've got Stonewall, obviously, for gender identity and sexuality, but for disability and race, there's not really comparable initiatives such as Athena Swan, and I think it's probably questionable the extent to which Athena Swan has achieved what it might have hoped to achieve. So that's sort of where we are at the moment. And as you said, there's lots of areas that are really under-researched, and at the moment the thing I'm most interested in is the under-researching of women's health.
That sounds like a very interesting and a broad field as well, and of course very important. I was wondering, what is the one thing, or well, what are the things that you find most challenging about your research? Could be the day-to-day thing or a general thing.
So I think the thing we're finding most challenging at the moment is the lack of interest in funding research about women, particularly women's health. So the kind of feedback we keep getting is that this is really important research, but it's not interesting. And unless you're researching a terminal condition, and at the moment, unless that happens to be COVID, it's difficult to get funding, which then is the flip side of it. In some ways, the most rewarding aspect is that employees, employers, trade unions, government officials are so desperate for this research, and you can have a change, you can affect change quite quickly for people and actually improve their working lives. And that, for me, was a real turning point in my career, was thinking, this isn't about the journal publications I can get out. It isn't about me ticking the boxes on my CV for what I need to get to the next stage. It is, I want to both contribute intellectually to my field, but also actually improve people's working lives, because work is such a big part of our lives. So for me, the thing that's most challenging has a kind of almost ironic flip side to it, which is, although the funders might say it's not very interesting, everybody that uses the research says it's incredibly important and really interesting.
Okay, I see. That is, well, on one hand, it's quite depressing that people that have the money do not recognize the importance.
Yeah.
But at least everybody else does. At least you have the applications, which must be really rewarding. So moving a bit to the disability in academia topic that we were wanting to speak about a bit. So first of all, let's clarify the language, because I admit I was myself a bit confused by the use of disabled, like the words disabled people, that as opposed to people with a disability. Could you please just explain why we use
absolutely. So this is in some ways quite bound to national differences, but in the UK we tend to say disabled person, and that comes from the social model of disability, which underpins disability activism in the UK. And under the social model of disability, we draw a distinction between what's called an impairment, and I don't like the term impairment, but that's the term that's used. So that, for example, might be a mobility impairment. So someone has a mobility impairment and they are not able to access certain buildings. So what we say is, it's not having a mobility impairment that's disabling, it's the environment that isn't accessible to you that's disabling. And one of the examples I quite often use in my teaching, when we used to teach in person, is to be in a lecture hall and say, if you were a wheelchair user, or if you are a wheelchair user, how easy to access was this lecture hall? And usually there's stairs to get into the lecture hall, or you go in at the back of the lecture hall, then you've got to walk down all the stairs, to get to the front, or there's no toilet nearby, or the doors are not automatic. So if you had a mobility impairment, you wouldn't be able to hold the door open and get through it at the same time. So someone isn't then disabled by their mobility impairment, they're disabled by the fact that the lecture hall is inaccessible and was not designed for their needs in order to get in. And in a laboratory setting, an example that we've heard is generally lab benches are set at one height, which is not a height if you're a wheelchair user that would be any of use to you. Whereas if all lab benches were adjustable to height as a default, then you wouldn't need a specific lab bench that was lower for somebody who's a wheelchair user. So the reason we say disabled person is because someone is disabled by the environment rather than by their condition. Now, there are limits to that because obviously certain conditions may be disabling, they may be incredibly painful, they may be progressive, and there's only so many adjustments or changes to the environment that you could make. But generally in the UK, we say disabled person. Now, in the US, you hear person first language more often, and that's where the argument is we need to see the person, not the disability. But in the US, we're seeing a move towards disabled person over person with disability as what's called an identity first model. So just as we would say a black woman, or a gay man, we wouldn't say a man with gayness or a woman with blackness. That being disabled is an identity. So people say I'm a disabled person. So we are seeing a shift, and in terms of whether or not it's offensive, it's generally not offensive because it's so international and different parts of the world use the same language so differently that whenever I'm presenting this, I always just start off and explain that's why I'm saying disabled person. And I don't get offended if somebody says person with disability or people with disability. Some disabled people do. And where you see it particularly being seen as offensive is with autism. So many autistic people do not like person first language. As one participant said to me, I don't carry my autism around in my handbag. It's part of who I am. So some people do find that offensive, but not everybody does. So generally, I think if you don't mean to be offensive, you won't offend. But I think, if you just set out and say, this is why I'm coming from the place I'm coming from. So for me, I'm coming from a social model of disability place. So I would argue that we are disabled by our environment, not necessarily by the impairment that we may have.
Thank you so much. This is such a useful explanation as well, especially since my first language is not English, as you can probably hear. It's a bit confusing which one is which, but thanks so much for this explanation. And so I wanted to ask about the part of your research that focuses on disability in highly skilled jobs. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask, what are the main issues or obstacles that disabled people face when they're entering or working in academia?
So we focus on academia because, as I said earlier, we've had Athena Swan for a long time. That discussion is sort of fairly well on, but there's not been a comparable discussion about disability. And we know that the rate reporting of disability is far, far lower than the actual prevalence of disability. So the Higher Education Statistics Authority will say something in the region of 5%. Obviously, that's slightly different between year and year of staff are disabled, whereas we know through REF submission data that it's much higher than that. And I actually think it's probably even higher than REF data would suggest. If you think that 1 out of every 2 of us will have a cancer diagnosis at some point in our life, and cancer automatically confers the status of disability under the Equality Act, then the rates have to be much, much higher, particularly when we think about mental health as well in academia. So in terms of what the challenges are, our research has shown that the main challenge really is a lack of understanding of what disability is and a lack of understanding of what it isn't. So there's an assumption that if someone's disabled, it means they can't do the job. And obviously that's not the case. And for students, it's by no means perfect, but we do have measures in place to support disabled students. But then if you become a member of staff, all of that support falls away. And people described it as a cliff edge, that they fell off a cliff edge. So when they went, say, from their PhD into a postdoc, that they just lost all the support that they had. So the biggest barrier is also internalized stigma about disability. So the idea of, well, I don't see any disabled people around me, so therefore you can't be a disabled academic. And I heard that many times, but also the extra work that you have to do if you're disabled, for example, to access adjustments or to tell your head of department that you're disabled and these are the adjustments you need. And then what will happen is 3 years' time, you get a new head of department because they rotate, and then you have to have the same conversation again. So the barriers really were around poorly informed line managers and research leaders, so head of laboratories, PhD supervisors, etc., internalized stigma about disability, the kind of university structures you have to navigate to kind of get any sort of support. And also people were very reluctant to tell any human resource management department within a university that they were disabled because they felt it would mean they wouldn't get a promotion, or if they were moving from postdoc into a lectureship that they wouldn't be able to secure that kind of post. So There are a lot of barriers. It's a tricky one. As a union caseworker, sometimes people say, do you think I should tell the university? And I always say, well, you should, but you have to remember that not everybody you're telling will understand what you mean when you tell them. You can't assume that because you've told them that you're autistic, that they understand what that means and they'll know what to put in place for you. So we found the biggest barrier was at early career. So PhD into postdoc, postdoc into lectureship. But there are later career barriers, particularly when it comes to promotion, and people internalizing that to the extent that they won't apply for a promotion or that they choose to leave higher education altogether. And what our data suggested is that scientists working in the private sector or public sector found it much easier to navigate a career and felt they were better supported than they are in universities.
Yeah, that is not ideal at all, to say the least, definitely. So I realized that you're speaking about what disability is and isn't, and I never asked what is the definition or what does it describe?
Yeah, so in the UK, you are legally protected if you have an impairment or a condition that lasts for 12 months or more and affects your ability to do day-to-day activities, and employment is considered a day-to-day activity. There are conditions which automatically lead to protection under the Equality Act, and that's cancer, HIV, and multiple sclerosis. For any other condition, it's about the effect and the duration of that effect. So, for example, if I broke my leg, I am unlikely to be affected for 12 months or more. So I might be severely affected, but it's a short-term thing. Whereas if I had a condition that meant I was frequently falling over and frequently breaking limbs that was going to last for 12 months or more, then it would be protected under the Equality Act as disability.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. And so maybe back to the questions. I was wondering if there's something that perhaps recently changed, either to the better or worse, maybe, hopefully not, for disabled people entering or already in academia.
So, I mean, something big has happened over the past 12 months, which is the pandemic. And what we've seen is that everybody basically was sent to go and work from home with like 24 hours notice, pretty much. And for some disabled people, was absolutely fantastic because they didn't have to worry about commute anymore. They could work in a space that was, tailored to their needs, and it worked really well for them. So actually, for many disabled people in academia, they've reported that the last 12 to 14 months have been a period where they've thrived. For those with mental health conditions, have maybe found the reverse, that being isolated and being stuck at home all the time has not been great. So I think for the pandemic, we can't talk about this without recognizing that our way of working has shifted. And many disabled people have been asking for years, look, I just want to work from home 2 or 3 days a week, to be told, no, you'd never get any work done. You couldn't possibly do that. And then within 24 hours, everybody was at home, and it turned out you absolutely can work at home and get your work done. Obviously, if you do field work, that's more difficult, laboratory work. But even in my field, if you researched festivals, for example, well, you can't do that at the moment. So not everything transfers to online. So it's been both a good thing for some people, and for others, it's maybe exacerbated mental health conditions. What we don't know, and I'd be interested in finding out, is whether it's been beneficial for people with gynecological health conditions. So, for example, if you're managing severe pain, that might be easier to do at home, but equally, you've probably not been able to access your GP or your consultant for the care that you need. So it's been a period of learning some things that are good, but also recognizing there's some downsides to it as well.
So, and does that mean that you'll probably have lots of data to examine how the pandemic impacted this?
That's what we're hoping to do, yes. So our data collection actually finished just before the pandemic started, and it's affected our project quite significantly because we can't deliver the in-person virtual reality training that we were hoping to do. So we've had to shift everything online, which in some ways has worked really well for us because it's meant that we can reach many more people, and we can speak to people in Canada, the States, New Zealand and Japan without having to go there, and everybody's in the same position. So it's been both a blessing, but also, I suppose, extra challenges for us.
Absolutely, yeah, that sounds quite challenging. But I was wondering, so since we've talked about like what the situation is, do you have any ideas how it might evolve in the next few years or even decades?
So I hope, I don't know if it will happen, but I hope that we've learned over the past 14 months a bit more about accessibility and understanding that actually some kind of blended approach probably works quite well. So I know our PhD students have asked for seminars to stay virtual because they can attend from anywhere and we can have speakers from all over the world without it costing a fortune. So I'm hoping we can move on from that. But I also hope that through the pandemic, we've realised that not everybody is working in an ideal home sort of situation, and that it's not just about internet connectivity, that some people are living in very cramped accommodations, maybe not safe. And I hope we've had a raised awareness of that, of people's home situations and of mental health as well. So what we also know is more and more people are going to become disabled. And all of us, if we live long enough, will become disabled. And I hope we can raise awareness, and that's what we're trying to do in our research with senior people in universities and in the private sector. Look, this is what disability is, this is how it affects people, and this is how you can support people, because if we can have more disabled scientists, we're going to produce better science. And otherwise, we're missing out on that experience. It's now considered sort of normal to have patients involved in healthcare research, for example, but hopefully moving away from the idea that disabled people are there to be researched rather than to be the researcher. So I think there will be a shift. There has been suggestions that Brexit will force a shift because the science workforce, there's such a skill shortage in the UK that universities and other science employers can't afford to lose people in the way they might have done before. But it does require a culture shift, I think. What we also know, of course, is that younger people who've been through a different school system are used to having adjustments at school. So if they're dyslexic, for example, they're used to having support. Then they go to university, now they're expecting it in employment, and that might push a shift as well. What we don't know is the longer terms of COVID. So, for example, difficulty accessing healthcare and delayed diagnosis for things like cancer will have a very detrimental effect. So I think it's probably quite a mixed picture, but I do have some hope that the pandemic has raised people's understanding of disability, and also that we all face different challenges.
That is definitely true. Yeah, I think you're very right. Okay, and what do you think that should change? So you've mentioned things that should make the situation better. Sorry.
Because, as I said, Athena Swan's been on the go for a while, right? And so people know about maternity leave now, which 10 years ago was still like shock horror, someone's going on maternity leave. So it's quite slow progress. But what we need is for people to understand what disability is. We need for it to be less stigmatized so that people can talk about it. And there's a saying in disability, which is you cannot be what you cannot see. And one of the things that came up in my data, and I know you want to talk about anecdotes, this is one of my most powerful anecdotes, was someone I interviewed, and he'd worked in the private sector where he'd had a lot more support. He wanted to become an academic. That's really what he wanted to become. And he said to me, one of my professors told me they were disabled, and it made me realise that I could do that. And so by having greater visibility of disabled scientists, academics, actually across all disciplines in senior positions, whether it's as a PhD supervisor or head of laboratory or deputy principal or head of department, anything like that, shows to students coming through, hey, I can do that. People like me exist in those kind of roles. So that, to me, I think is one of the really big changes that we need. And we see it happening in other sectors where senior people will come forward and they will start a disability working group, for example, and say, I am disabled, this is my health condition, this is how it affects me. And then it fosters a culture where other people can come forward. So that's what I would like to see, is greater visibility of disabled people in senior positions. And not everybody has to be Stephen Hawkins, right? It's in all sorts of different levels, and a recognition that disability isn't just wheelchair use, that disability is also neurodivergence, it's also being deaf, it's also having Crohn's disease, it's also having cancer, that all of this is disability, and actually all of us are affected by disability one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I want to ask about the Disability Inclusive Science Careers program that you're involved in.
Yeah, so it's funded by the EPSRC, which your listeners will probably know what that is, Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and it's part of their Inclusion Matters program. And they funded 11 projects aimed to really create a step change in inclusion within the EPSRC remit. And 10 projects are broadly on gender, and there's one on disability, and that's ours. And I'm the program director for that. And it's a participatory action research project developing and delivering training for research leaders on more disability inclusion. And the training should have been done in person. It's all been done virtually. And it's a mixture of, just as we talked about here, why we would say disabled person, not people with disability, what's the Equality Act definition. We have vignettes from the research, so the kind of anecdotes that you're talking about that people discuss. And then they move on to virtual reality gaming, where they get to practice what they've learned. So there's 2 games. The first game is an interview panel for a postdoc who's being interviewed for a position. And I won't give the game away because at some point, hopefully, you might want to have a go with the game. But suffice to say, she is being interviewed and one of the interview panel is completely inappropriate with her about her disability. And you are then at the end of the game given some options of what you would do if you were on the interview panel and you were faced with that. And then the second game is immersive virtual reality, and you are a senior academic in an open plan office, and one of your postdocs says to you, I can't work in this office because the noise levels and the lights are too much for me. So they're experiencing sensory overload. And you have the opportunity to play with that game, adjust the office, put in place different workplace adjustments, and then see what the impact is both on the sort of bottom line financially of the department and also, most importantly, on the postdoc. So it's pretty exciting. We haven't trialed the VR game yet because obviously we can't take VR headsets into people's houses. They're too expensive, but we've done the rest of it and it's been absolutely fantastic. And I've been really, honestly, quite moved to the extent to which people engage with the training. So we're delivering it to senior leaders in universities. And what we're seeing is that it is improving not just their understanding of disability, but their confidence in how to talk to a disabled person about making their environment more inclusive.
That sounds incredible, actually.
It is really cool. And when I designed it and someone said, you haven't just put the virtual reality in to be cool, have you? I'm like, a bit. People will remember it. They'll remember doing it. And actually, it's just people really engage with it and it works really well. So we're very excited about it.
Yeah, it does have the cool ideas of being put into someone's shoes. And yeah, it does sound very cool. So you already mentioned some anecdotes. Do you have any others that you say about, from your research, something that people told you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the research I've done around gynecological health conditions in science careers, which is obviously is part of disability, has been quite profound. And there's been some quite challenging stories that people have told. So most of my research is qualitative. So it is about listening to people's experiences. And some of it's quite distressing. And when I teach it, I always say, just to say, some of this is going to be distressing. But what becomes really clear is that women's bodies are just not accommodated in how science is organised. So one example, someone was telling me that the students all been taken on a field trip and it was something like a 4-hour bus ride and there was no toilet on the coach. And the person who'd organised the trip hadn't factored in a toilet break, which is obviously no good if you're managing your period, but actually it's no good if you have a bladder, right? Because we all need to go to the toilet. And one participant who said to me that she was actually going to withdraw from science because she had endometriosis and she wasn't able to find a job that enabled her to manage the endometriosis because of the fieldwork requirements. So we can look at disability, but we need to recognise that some conditions are more stigmatised than others. And if you work in a male-dominated environment, it can be very hard, for example, to talk about heavy bleeding or fertility problems or miscarriage. So there's obviously a lot more work to do in that. I'm still analysing the data, but those are some of the scenarios that really, really struck out for me, but also the sense of isolation that many disabled people said they felt. So one participant, who's a woman in her 50s, and she'd been diagnosed as autistic relatively late in life. And her job was that she was quite successful in her job, but she said to me, I've never had a friend. And that was really upsetting, I have to say, to think, why has this person never had a friend? She's an absolutely lovely person. And it's because she just felt that people at work wouldn't understand her. So she didn't go and speak to people and she felt really isolated. So there's often a misapprehension or misunderstanding that autistic people don't want to be friends with people. And that's one of the kind of clear anecdotes is absolutely autistic people want to have friends. They just may go about it in a slightly different way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think if you do qualitative research, it can be quite upsetting at times. So yeah, there's some of the anecdotes that really stick in my head.
Yeah, that is true. So I read some of your articles and while doing research for this interview, obviously, and that's why I'm asking, because some of them were really shocking, honestly, such as for example, some about the miscarriage that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Very shocking, to be honest. So yeah, I think it's very important to hear them and have this personal experience. And you also said you wanted to talk about psychology.
Yes, so so I did my undergraduate degree in psychology and history, and I wanted to be a psychologist. And then once I studied history, once I studied psychology, I thought I don't want to do this anymore. And for me, I then moved towards sociology, much more of a sociological perspective. And really, for me, it follows on from what we were just saying, that I think qualitative research is really important if you want to understand how people experience the world and how they perceive it, and also how you perceive the world will affect your concept of reality on it. And psychology doesn't allow you to do that. And psychology does tend to put people into boxes. So if you're autistic, it therefore means X, Y, and Z. And one of the people I interviewed actually had been, quote unquote, diagnosed as autistic by a very famous academic who works in this field. And they'd actually been traumatized by the process because they'd been told, where's the effect of, if you know you're autistic, you can't be autistic. And are you sure you're not a lesbian? Because it's not normal for women to be autistic. And it's that kind of attitude that really pushed me away from psychology. And it's not until I've been much further on in my career, I've known how to articulate it, that it's around the kind of ontology and epistemology of psychology, but also the politics of it. So the politics of psychology tends to be much more individualized. So saying, well, you're disabled, and so therefore we want to fix disability and get rid of disability. Whereas my view is disability brings diversity. People are disabled, and we need to make the world adjusted to everybody and accessible to everyone rather than eradicating difference. So it gives me a very different perspective, both in terms of how I go about my research, but also in terms of how I do knowledge exchange and impact my union work and my broader social justice activism that I do outside of academia.
Okay, yeah, thanks for sharing that. I didn't realize, but from this point of view, the psychology perspective sounds very weird. I never realized.
I'm sure lots of psychologists will disagree with me, but that's my reason for leaving psychology.
Of course, and your experience as well, that's true. And another thing that you mentioned, you worked on lots of policies, I mean, with the governments, so the Scottish government or the UK government. What's your experience from that, if I can ask?
So it's more Scottish government than UK government. And so I was involved in the expert panel. It's called Expert Panel on Environmental Charging Measures or something like that. And really my role there was to try and embed disability inclusion and broader EDI into that. So, for example, recognising that single-use plastic straws were actually developed as an accessibility aid for disabled people. And if we ban them, or if we make them very hard to access, that discriminates against disabled people. So that's where my work comes from, but also making sure that I respond to any consultations that come out of the UK or devolved governments with our data. I'm being sort of quite precise with the data. You know, our data suggests X, Y, and Z. If you were to do this, this is the likely consequence. And it's something I would encourage anybody to get involved in, really, as an academic. My experience is that policymakers, whether they're elected or through civil service, really want to hear from academics. You know, whatever kind of research you're doing, you've got something you can contribute, whether it's your actual knowledge or whether you know how to find the right information that they're looking for. So my experience has been quite a good one. You're maybe not going to get the pace of change that you might want. And obviously in Scotland, we've got the issue of certain things are devolved and other things are reserved. And employment is reserved, employment law. So it's, for me, really, a lot of the efforts have to be at the UK national level. But yeah, so that's my experience, is just go for it. You've got nothing to lose. And when the Parliament comes back at Holyrood, they will have these cross-party working groups. And if there's one that covers your area of research, just email them and ask if you can come and speak to them. And they'll almost certainly say yes.
That actually sounds incredible. Thanks for sharing that. I didn't imagine that politicians were so accessible.
Yes, very much so in Scotland, yeah.
That is great, yeah. Having the experience of someone from a different country with different maybe culture, it might not necessarily be so. So I think here in Scotland is very great. It's really great. And you also say you sometimes will work with companies to help them create better condition and diversify workforce. I was wondering, what does this look like and what sort of issues do you usually find? What are the common suggestions, these kind of things?
So at the moment, it's mostly about disability, as you can imagine, because we've got this project. And in some ways it's quite similar to universities, although I do tend to find that private companies and also public sector are a lot further ahead than universities in terms of EDI work. But a lot of it is just about, this is what disability is, this is the social model of disability. And just as you said, you read some of the examples and were quite shocked by them. Our examples, all we've changed is the names of the institutions and the individuals. And people will say, that can't be true. That doesn't really happen. It's like, no, that is what happened. That's a direct interview quote. So some of the issues are the same. What we also find, of course, in the private sector is much more of an interest in how do we make sure we attract disabled customers as well. And one of the ways it's felt to do that is have a more visibly diverse workforce. So they are interested in the business case to some extent, but also in the social justice argument of, we just want to have a more diverse workforce. It's better to have a diverse workforce. So that's the kind of issues that are coming up in the private sector.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, anyway, the next round of questions are a bit more relaxed about hobbies and free time. Because, yeah, as you say, it's very clear the academics are people, and that's something that I really want to,
Apparently we're people, yeah. These are quite tricky questions, aren't they, at the moment? Because if you'd asked me 18 months ago, what do you like to do in your spare time? It would have been, I like to go out for meals. I like to go to museums and art galleries and things. At the moment, we can't do a lot of that. I'm also quite active in a political party. So that takes up quite a bit of my, as we run up to the election. So I'm in a book club, which is great because it's not full of academics. So that's always nice to speak to normal people. I love cooking. I love going for walks. Where I live in East Lothian, there's loads of wildlife to go and see. I've taken up lots of different types of cooking during lockdown, so particularly Korean food. So those are the kind of things that I like to do. I don't work excessive hours, so I don't work evenings and weekends, which is quite unusual in academia. I'm not very good at not working away annual leave, but I'm not going to do that this year. I'm going to draw stronger boundaries around it. In the past, it's been quite difficult because it might have been, I've booked annual leave and then a funder said, oh, we want to do PR on the 14th of August. I'm like, I'm on holiday then. Well, I better not go on holiday because otherwise I can't do the PR and you need me to do it on that day. So, I think in some ways I'm not a typical academic because I don't work evenings and weekends. And I know there is a real expectation of academics to do that, but I really hope we can move away from that bit because it's not. And when I say not working evening weekends, I don't mean if you're balancing childcare, etc., you work in the evenings because perhaps you've been looking after your kids during the day. That's not kind of what I mean. Of a lot of disabled people work quite flexible hours. But I think we need people to not be working 70, 80-hour weeks. It's not that healthy.
Absolutely, yeah. And it also can, for example, I'm thinking about it a lot, and it can be off-putting for people to enter academia, having these long hours weeks. Yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks. And is there something that you like to do to distress as like one thing?
What do I like to do? I mean, honestly, I'm a big fan of a box set. So Netflix or something like that. I do think going for a walk, particularly here where there's lots of nature, for me personally, is quite de-stressing. De-stress as it doesn't distress me, as it de-stresses me. Also, I think there's something about finding people that you get on with in universities. And I always talk to early career academics about find your people, whether it's that they are really interested in similar things to you, or they all hate networking and so you all hang out together at conferences because you hate networking or something like that. But finding your people and talking to them. And for me, being part of the union is kind of part of that because it's about trying to fix the problems that I encounter rather than trying to be resilient to them, saying, well, actually, they don't need to exist in the first place. And so let's see if we can stop these problems from arising. So, that's it for me. Lots of different things. I can't say I have like one set thing that I do, but certainly during the pandemic, going for a walk and seeing nature has been a really big part of it.
Absolutely, yeah, that sounds really nice. You also mentioned a political party.
Yes.
Do you want to say which one?
It's not a secret. It's all over my Twitter. It's the Labour Party.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
You can't miss it. It's all over my Twitter at the moment. So, I'm the women's officer for my local branch, and then for my constituency, I'm the trade union liaison officer.
Okay, I didn't know that, so I just wanted to know.
But they're not a million. I mean, it's sort of slightly odd in a way because some of the things I do outside of universities are so closely aligned with what I do in my job. And actually being an academic in the kind of work that I do is quite useful. So I'm also helping our local candidate with his campaign, and I'm able to find information that he needs. And it's not necessarily because it's my area, but I know how to search the literature. I know how to find the information. I know what to do with it when I find it. So it's there's a strong crossover. I can't tell my students how to vote, and I never would do that, but I don't hide it either. So
great, thank you. And finally, how would you like to spend your ideal holiday? What's your idea?
So, I mean, holidays at the moment just seem like such a fantasy, right? So I sort of swivel between just having some nice time off at home, and I'm quite a fan of a quote unquote staycation, of just having some time at home, sorting out the house, spending time with my cats. And living in Edinburgh means that during August you can have 2 weeks holiday at home and have more things to do than is humanly possible. So there's that. If I were to go on holiday, for me, it would involve food. So I absolutely love to eat. I can't emphasize how much I love to eat. So one of the things I've started doing during lockdown is watching YouTube food travel blogs, where somebody, I don't know, goes to Tokyo and tries the street food in Tokyo, and then they go to Kyoto and try the street food there. So that for me would be to go somewhere and basically eat for a week. That would be the ideal holiday.
That sounds incredible.
Yeah. But with no alarm clock in the morning. That's the important thing. But yeah, lots of food. That's the ideal holiday for me.
That does sound incredible. And hopefully it's possible again soon. So
it will be eventually. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's right. The next few questions are, I call it, well, it's called the quick fire questions.
Yep.
I call it the 5-year-olds questions. It's short questions that usually require short answers, but feel free to elaborate. So I was wondering if you have a place that you like and keep coming back to.
So it will probably be either Sydney or New York.
Great change. Great choice. Sorry. Amazing. If you could have a superpower, which one would you pick?
Oh, do you know, I think about this all the time. What would my ex-woman power be? I think possibly to fly.
Mm-hmm. That's a great one. And since we were speaking about the holiday, would you prefer one in the hot or in the cold, or doesn't matter as long as there's food?
So there's cold and there's cold, right? So I went to Chicago once in December, and that is as cold. I never want to be that cold again. That's not pleasurable in any way to me. So I don't mind the cold from a UK perspective, but from certain parts of the world, cold is cold. But equally, I don't mind the heat, but I wouldn't want Dubai heat. So I suppose fairly temperate, I guess, although I obviously do love Australia, and it does get pretty hot in Australia. But yeah, not 50 degrees centigrade. That is too hot. Hottest I've ever been was I flew to Melbourne, and we landed at, you landed like 5:30 in the morning, and the pilot came on and said, it's 35 degrees centigrade outside, and that was at 5:30. And that was really unpleasant, because actually, just as you can't walk anywhere in the severe cold, you can't walk anywhere in the severe heat.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm actually I like the heat, because so like Greece was lovely. The last time I went to a conference in Greece, that was properly hot, but you could still walk places and look at things. So probably the heat, I think.
Mm-hmm. That sounds relatable. And all those great places that you're naming. Yeah. Do you have a favorite music genre and perhaps a favorite song?
So not necessarily genre, but my favorite artist would be Prince, and probably Purple Rain from Prince.
Purple rain, purple rain. Purple rain, purple rain. Purple rain, purple rain.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And do you have a favorite book?
Handmaid's Tale.
Mm-hmm.
So not because it's fun, because it's not fun, but I see the novel and the TV series very differently to a lot of other people. I see them both as a story of hope, that there will always be resistance. So I know people have been quite negative and said, oh, they're sort of just misery and it's just bad treatment of women. And I know there are criticisms of The Handmaid's Tale that it appropriates the experiences of marginalised women and women of colour. So I am cognizant of that. But to me, they're about hope, that there will always be people who resist totalitarian regimes. And we know that's true. So for me, I find them incredibly hopeful.
That is a very nice message from such a book. Yeah, I found it difficult to read, to be honest.
Yeah, it is difficult to read. Especially, I mean, I read it when I was about 16, 17 because I studied it for A-level. I think now it's probably harder to read because we know these things are happening.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes it in a way harder to read, but I still cheer at times.
That's good, great. And do you have a favorite meal?
Oh, wow. I mean, that's a really tough question to ask somebody who loves food, right? So as much as I love loads of different kinds of food and loads of different kinds of cuisine, I think it's probably going to be something like egg and chips.
I can totally relate. It's not. I like it as well. So yeah. And do you have a favorite animal?
One of them is sleeping to my left-hand side, and I've got two cats. One's called Blossom, the other one's called Lily, but I call them Judith Butler and Karen Barad, who are two of my favourite feminist theorists. But I actually love all animals. But cats. Oh, well, I love dogs too, but dogs are much harder to look after. So I've got two sleepy rescue cats.
That is incredible. I'm so sorry I can't see the cats, but
no, she's on the floor, so you wouldn't be able to see her. But she's beautiful. You just have to take my word for it.
I totally believe that. That is right. Okay. And as a finishing question, so please feel free to elaborate. Is there something that you think that current students, people who listen to this interview, and also people who will strive to enter highly skilled jobs, should know and keep in mind?
That it is possible. It is possible. We know that there are barriers, but I'm a professor, I'm disabled. It is possible to get there. There are many senior academics who've had a cancer diagnosis, who are neurodivergent, or who have mental health conditions. It is absolutely possible to do it. And there are adjustments in place. There's far more support than most people realise. Too much time is spent focusing on getting disabled people just into any kind of employment. But actually, if you want to be a scientist or you want to be a researcher, so you might be on my side, on the social sciences side, it is absolutely possible to do it.
That is a great message. Thank you so much. Kate, thank you so much for your time and for all your answers.
You've been listening to Inside, the University of St. Andrews Physics Society's podcast. Thanks to our amazing interviewees for their interesting and useful insights. This podcast was produced by Marilyn Rosenquist and myself, Veronika Sedláková. To find out more about the Physics Society and what we do, find us on Facebook, Instagram or LinkedIn, or search St. Andrews Physics Society for our website. Goodbye!